Hello everyone, today we talk about the Saracens, somehow overlooked topic in pop culture for a reason that we will explain now. I already made multiple videos about them, and I already expressed sort of the main, say the main issues, right? The main topics, the main subjects of this of this world a bit on its own. That in fact is not. It's not framed, in my opinion, in satisfactory ways whenever you come across, if you ever come across, right? For a reason of this kind. Now, you know that I am a beyond ultra right-wing imperial Catholic traditionalist, so this should fugate any doubt regarding where I lay in general as far as this sort of topics get, right? People tend to frame me within, say, politological categories that are a bit weighted to this is not really one that you find in pop culture either, right? There is not a compass that's been designed to evaluate it, but it's obvious that I care, obviously, say, as far as it's complex, from personally, historically, and politically, all the to list all and explain in one video, which I am not going to do today, of course, all the issues that come with just being alive and how to cope with each of these spheres, let's say. But it's obvious that the main interest I have on Schwerpunkt, just per se, is to talk about history. Yes, in an insightful and critical way, but still sticking to historical objectivity in the sense that, right, doesn't matter where you lay ideologically, and exactly because of that, actually, if your ideology is not just sort of a place where to hide behind, to illustrate reality on a moral and scientific basis. And so, through the historical method, if properly wielded, should provide you with, and especially giving history the proper, say, dimensions of historical relevance, right, across all the various layers of topics that you can come across, right. And the more I work with history, both professionally and in this way of Schwerpunkt that is sort of a sidebar, that the more I realize how difficult it is to make a historical point in order to transmit the accurate, right? So it's not even just the correct, because that brings with itself, say, what is exactly correct on the basis of which standard, right? Because in order to be, say, history already by itself does not provide you with this sort of orthodoxy just per se. It's you rather that through the same method has to find out what history actually means. And so to have a vision that goes beyond whichever parameter has been sort of used in order to make you understand history, how you were told, how you just heard of it, right, and thought it like. This is the biggest challenge. I could make many videos just on this topic, and I realize that some of you are fundamentally aware already of some of the highlights, at least. In any case, it's particularly true whenever I see one topic that, for the reasons I will try to explain today, is properly not even, again, digested within a certain cultural horizon, right? I will probably make a video on this, but I was using artificial intelligence in order to quickly fill the playlist description that I have, as you know, hundreds of playlists, and up to some year ago, I used to write sort of mini description of the video before I inserted all the links, all the sort of, look at the other ones I made, etc. And I abandoned that sort of quick description. And I thought, well, maybe in order to get more views, just to catch more information, say, from the search, the filter, and so on for the audience to come across my content more easily, I can now fill this 5,000 characters with just giving a prompt to AI and say, I don't know, this is a playlist about history of warfare, say, and insert what it is. And I basically put it away because honestly, I'm very bored with artificial intelligence. I think it's too dumb, right, at this point to have any practical use, especially as far as history and historical criticism is concerned. And in this specific case, probably I will keep using it if say, but lowering the quality of those descriptions. So maybe even I'm just not aware of the fact they will not be read or they will not actually enter the search engine. It's just an experiment, all right? But everything probably does work with the phrases, whatever. And the first thing that I realized is that artificial intelligence, at least for the way it is created today in this or sort of cheaply available, sites and so on, is not just, of course, criminally unreliable as far as historical information is concerned, but just it's based on an incredibly narrow perspective that I will not specify in general, but that probably emerges from these topics, essentially listing just major political, military, or social events of a given part of, if you're talking medieval Europe, and as Westerners we can proudly, of course, be forgiven for a level of Western centrism of some sort, except, right, that this thing goes far beyond what I think even just a basic, say, continental European medieval history manual in any even public, which, our ones are at least good institutions would provide. To the point of, I want to remain vague, but let's say talk about, I don't know, medieval warfare, and just to have a narrow sort of the 100 Years' War, the Wars of the Roses, as a sort of just a random throwing around of examples, right? And except when you start doing over and over again, as I tried to do even just for 10 of these playlists, I realized it was just a repetitive pattern without any other nuisance. Of course, if you gave them a prompt about, I don't know, medieval Germany or the medieval Balkans or whatever, there would be some, it would give you the answer, but first of all becoming dramatically more unreliable than it already was, and still focusing on topics that somehow were connected to, first of all, the structuralistic sort of Marxistic view of history that has been violently imposed on us, in language, in thought, in just in perspective, and not really grasping of course, the reason why we study history too is just the complexity of it, right? And you would say, why are you talking about this regarding the Saracens? Because I think the Saracens suffer dramatically of this specific dynamic, as much in part as the Magyars could do. In fact, I already made multiple videos about the Magyars explaining in part some of that, but let's say I studied the age of what, in fact, we call in our own historiography the one of the second invasions. It's a very sort of European, continental European, so wider than, say, just a certain region-based idea of, the Middle Ages. This could stem from many different views. I study actually from manuals that, yes, of course, were there when, say, the European Union had already, of course, affirmed itself and somehow also pumped in this greater sense of identity towards which the continent should move towards. And Schwerpunkt is also a humble attempt to sort of influence European traditional awareness of what were actually the cornerstones of our identity for an explicit, I'm pretty open about this, an imperial Catholic purpose, right? I don't have any. This is the meaning of the channel in many ways. The purpose, right? The political purpose of it, at least, in that direction. The point, of course, is that if you look at, say, search for this stuff, make a comparison, how much there is about the Vikings out there, how much there is about the Magyars, and how much there is about the Saracens. Now, I believe as a medievalist that objectively the Vikings were the most important of these three groups. At least they were the ones that, of course, brought with, say, more consequences, at least in the ways that we can appreciate, especially northern European history broadly meant, let's say, the northern half of Europe. Not only, of course, because the Vikings were, of course, all over the place, but, and say, post-Carolingian Europe was, every single kingdom of post-Carolingian Europe was raided by all these three peoples, right? We connect mostly Gaul with the Vikings, Germany with the Magyars, and Italy with the Saracens. But actually, these people, and it's a correct ratio, right? If you were to look at the majoritary dimension there. But of course, I think that overall, in spite of the greater importance the Vikings had, I do believe, and that's debatable as well, but only up to a certain point, I do believe the Vikings were more important. I still believe that, in this sense, the Vikings are actually, in absolute terms, underrepresented. I think that for all the Tolkien sort of cultural reference, and say pop cultural references about the Vikings, there is an insultingly low amount of actual Viking history and sort of warfare and whatever material out there, right? I think that the Vikings are disgustingly misused, that the people also that want to make identitaristic point about them, of course, are extremely weak compared to who the Vikings actually were and what they actually did. So I'm not making the usual case, we don't have to study just white European history, we have bullshit, right? You know, whatever the world history is, by far, Western one is, without any comparison, the single most important point, end of the story. And of course the Vikings had also a limited role within it, but I definitely think that the way, say, we also throw them around just in a sort of iconicistic fashion. Look, that's just a big, white guy from the north that smashes everything and he's so cool, and, and all the various different things that you can attach to that depending on where you lay politically or religiously, or whatever, or also socially to some degree. It's misused and misrepresented, right? However, whenever we get to talk about the specifics of the 9th, 10th century Europe and what was happening at the time, that's where you get among the pseudo-medievally literate, the incredible disproportion of Viking representation compared to lots of other peoples, not just even the Magyars or the Saracens, right? First of all, as you know from my videos about post-Carolingian Europe, I tribute also for how eventually the continent got rid of these threats. That, of course, say Western Europe had a dramatically impactful potential already at play for the literal boom of the following centuries. And that's when we look at the second invasion, this is true also for the Roman Empire, right? There's this idea that it's a catastrophistic one, that mostly for the Romans is fueled there by a bit of Anglocentrism, because yes, it is true that Britain had it particularly bad, and so generally speaking, or even not that much in say in actual life, that pretty bad things happened after the Romans left, but right, it's not a catastrophe even there. the real catastrophe is rather that we really know dramatically few about Britain compared to the rest of post Western Roman Europe, right? That remains also basically the center of at least the western half of the continent, and in a very sort of unique way, sort of this Latin Germanic, partly also Celtic fashion. Then there is Slavic Europe, there is the Byzantine world that is actually the true center for early medieval times, to an extent, however, that I would urge you to revisit, especially maybe it is about Latin Germanic Europe, all right? But this is not the point, because in some ways that is true, but it's not represented to the extent to which it even was true. But at the same time, there is a radical underestimation of what was happening in Western Europe as a whole. And this is true for the entire Middle Ages, because the idea is that if Britain was so dramatically underdocumented, basically it's because there had been an apocalypse that we should extend just by, say, psychological posture towards all the rest of post-Western Roman Europe, which frankly is not quite the case. Frankly, talking about the Franks as well, but not only, also talking about the Gothic or the Lombard worlds, the one of other populations had been brought down by the Franks, and so on. That had actually quite of a history, and definitely not one of particular underdevelopment, to say the least, right? So that's something which, generally speaking, it is true that also the socioeconomical bias has hijacked the way we look at history, that there is this overstress on the fact of how, the Middle Ages as such were just a very tough time. Well, as if, I don't know, the ancient world hadn't been like that, or as if in the modern world, the average people were more, let's say, freer politically and juridically in relative terms, which is also not true. So we get a lot of the sense that, for example, the age of the second age of invasions was oh my god, the worst thing that could happen. And of course there are, save us from the fury of the Normans kind of echoes. There is definitely destructions here and there caused by this. Here and there, I mean, in a very intensive fashion in some particular regions. There is no doubt of that. But if you look at the broader picture, realize that still that world somehow adapted to it, and that it wasn't crumbling, right? There is a deeper misunderstanding, in my opinion, in the lack of political literacy that doesn't show us essentially what even the continuity of the imperial ideology instead provides us with, right? Why is that the Carolingian Empire fell? And why is that the Roman Empire fell? Even assuming it did. But let's say, what does that practically mean? Is it a materialistic catastrophe, or is it actually a change in politics, in moral compass? Is there something more to that? That dimension is very often treated like, oh well, but we can't really say because the perceptions, all this sort of morally relativistic. But if you look here, if you look there, it's different. So you cannot generalize. Well, yeah, but if you even just look at the macroscopical sort of political reorganization of post-Roman Europe, you realize that there are, yes, massive differences, but exactly in the sense that these are, in that sense, paradoxically also quantitative, other than also qualitative, and so that the history of one province or one region is not the one of the other, also because it is objectively more or less important than another. And this is a concept, of course, that is at odds with all the sort of equality bullshit that you've been fed in the last decades, because the idea is that we shouldn't judge morally history, or even when we do that, it's just with sort of not even, right? I don't know, even a child sort of morality, without even understanding the concept of the fact that there is no thing, in fact, that you can compare to one another, because everything is different, and as such, it is compared to objective standards that you can scientifically verify, and that therefore make one thing worse or better than another, right? And that, as a historian, you must forcefully express as a judgment. Otherwise, you should find another job. And that does not really trick us. Yes, the 10th century was a pretty harsh time. It's called the Iron Century. There were lots of devastations because of these peoples. There were lots of gruesome things going on. But this doesn't mean that the backbone, right, of the Western world was substantially shattered, right? Especially if you do not take into account what the system before worked like, which is also a bit of, in empires everything worked well because everything was homogeneous and it was always in the same way. Then from a day to another it stopped and crumbled, and so it's a disaster. This is not actually how things work in reality. The empires are magnitudinal achievements just because, in fact, of the divine nature of the spirit that moves them, which is yet the other concept that today is not very popular because, of course, of populism, and so the sort of mental illness that fundamentally makes the average person thinking that they have any value just because they exist, and it is a terrible idea. It's the primary indicator of the cultural inferiority of a people, and not just, of course, of their complete historical illiteracy, but it is so a mix of fundamentally nationalistic and or socialistic and ultimately communistic, because that's where the road goes also as far as nationalism is concerned, and which is another thing that, of course, populists are not able to understand because they think that nationalism is right-wing. It is, going towards the right direction of right-wing, which is actually not the case at all. These peoples and the way they interacted with post-Carolingian Europe is often just seen as merely, let's say, these guys came from the outside, smashed everything, destroyed everything, and for no apparent reason, until you realize that, of course, the only reason why they put themselves in motion was the political turmoil, and even, the actual support that they received from within the system, right? The Scandinavians, the Magyars, what we call like the Saracens, that is much more complicated to define, as we'll see now, could do what they did exclusively because the continental Europeans used them actively in order to undermine the system, which is exactly what happens, of course, in an age of crisis, right? In an age of moral collapse, of sort of indebtment, and of incapability of solving, right, fundamental civilizational issues, right? But it's not a passivity as we intended, and even, of course, in those circumstances in which these peoples, and don't get me wrong, they were militarily capable and so on, and managing to overwhelm at a local level certain forces, which is absolutely the case still, right, were evidently not meant to carry out any other specific, and broader goal. I mean, let's be brutally honest about this. Start with the Vikings. The Vikings, Scandinavia was underdeveloped, and severely so, right? And part of the reason why Scandinavians began to do what they did is exactly the fact that they, as all the peoples living at the outskirts of civilization, they're always with their antenna tuned to catch any possible sign of political turmoil so that they can enter there, exploiting the crisis and getting something out of that. Scandinavia grew and developed and civilized itself truly during the Viking era, right? So it wasn't absolutely a phenomenon of sort of civilizational dynamic. Actually, the Vikings were the ones that were countering the same sort of everything has to remain like before mentality of isolationism and paranoia and sort of darkness that, of course, exists by some degree in every civilization, but especially the ones that still have to make some work in order to become just by obvious reasons of moral and material inferiority. But, right? They couldn't quite, aside from, say, I've heard all the possible things on the Vikings. Oh my God, they were so influential, possibly even as much as the Roman Empire. There are some AI-generated videos on YouTube that talk Vikings. Oh my God, they went across half of Europe unopposed, and they just, as if, they literally entered half of Europe. They didn't come even remotely to enter one fifth of Europe, right? In a consistent fashion, and of course they had an important impact on, especially some Northern European realities, especially those that were less populated, less developed. Think about, I don't know, Ireland. Think about even Scotland. Think about the colonization further northwest across the sea, etc. And of course, they left and they impacted these wars. They helped molding them. Right? You can say, of course, that the Rus, they had an influence there, but even there we realized that even the Slavs had already some systems that just used these guys as mercenaries, which is not really, it's yet another dynamic that has been cancelled from the equation, and just made a video explaining that this thing was absolutely normal, and it's even wrong to think that there was a phase of, say, Viking histories if these things had not been going on forever since millennia. Right, and of course at that point they did intensify, but they weren't really sort of like they happen in every civilization all the time. This is the important thing. We see it constantly in our videos about army organization and stuff and so on. You can pick areas saying, but look at Normandy, right? They also impact. Well, in that case, they were mostly, yes, Scandinavian settlers, but that fundamentally became purely Western Frankish subjects in everything. Politics, warfare, society. And yes, there was some spirit they had injected there as conquerors. They changed definitely the history of the world through the conquest of the Anglo-Danes, etc. But even in that, you cannot fail but to see a Western accomplishment, right? It was in fact the Frankish Normans that invaded and conquered and molded into a feudal kingdom what the Anglo-Danes had become, and also throughout an important crisis of the same system locally. And it was an incredibly elite and so continentally styled regime. The same goes for the Normans in southern Italy, for example. That Norman is a synecdoche in many ways. We will see it now even with the Saracens. It's pretty obvious, right? There were we could go on and on with this because I still have to make a lot of stuff on the Vikings that I still haven't made. But the same goes with the Magyars. Like the Magyars could do in Germany what they did because essentially of the princely wish in Central Europe to stay out of to be free of a sort of more centralized system. Except, of course, civilization is not a matter of personal opinion. At one point, it was too much. The Magyar incursions were risking to basically make half of the Eastern Frankish political and administrative system collapse, with major, in fact, civilizational consequences for everybody involved. So the Eastern Franks said, okay, too much. They united, and guess what happened to the Magyars? Right, they were crushed, they settled down, they Christianized, and they were also Germanized in a broader sense by the Germanic Empire. The Saracens as well. I mean, there is this also 19th century Darwinistic idea that in order to explain why why the Italians were not like the Romans, right? We have to engineer this fabrication that the Saracens would have come to pollute the race, because otherwise it's not possible that such a great race like the Romans fell to the actually pretty high, still highest continuously, right? The richest people in the world basically throughout all this time, and to level of the Italians. But never mind that, of course, there is no actual evidence of any major, first of all, ethnic or genetic or even linguistic influence from especially what we think, as we will see now, the Saracens were in Italy, and for the simple reason that the northern shores of the Mediterranean have always been overwhelmingly, magnitudinally, and disproportionately more developed, populated, and rich than North Africa. And of course, this impact could not factually exist. And aside from the fact that, of course, North Africa had been heavily colonized by the Romans, so that before the arrival, not even of the Arabs, right, but of the Arabicized elites in North Africa, Latin, or a form of Romance, was spoken there. The period, the numbers involved, the people, etc., that we call the Saracen year was fundamentally limited, and not only that, but the Italians had always been, before and after this, to involve themselves in a way or another, conflictually or even cooperatively with North Africa, and especially, as we will see now, essentially Tunisia, that had been that sort of close in a broader sense to Sicily, to the obvious, say, strategic management of the main choke points towards the western, between the eastern and the western Mediterranean. The Saracens, though, are, in this sense, I think, way more misunderstood than the other peoples. Right. After all, with the Vikings, you do have other peoples participating, and you have some Slavs. It's especially in the Baltic, it's somehow underestimated in a way. With the Magyars, you have this Ugro-Finnic people that surely had other groups, say, other elements within it, but fundamentally was the process of and so aside from the ethnogenesis of the same political group that eventually established this principality in the Hungarian steppe, it's somehow a cohesive reality. There were Vikings among the Magyars. There were other groups among them. There were Slavs, of course, and not just war bands, levied by the same Magyars in this broader Hungarian world, but literally among the Western Slavs as polities that had practically nothing to do with the Magyars, but that exploited that to counter the Germans. Made many videos about this, and so this gives you food for thought for many reflections, right? And it makes you see how we sort of painted these populations from which perspectives, for which purposes, and why did we decide to neglect certain aspects that have always been known. Also, this is the beauty of history, right? There is this idea that, oh my God, this especially for entertainment in documentaries, maybe people don't know. This is the most updated research. Look, it is true that still history must be studied a lot and better, but it's not because we actually lack the fundamental knowledge that has been already harvested and collected, and that also cannot be quite augmented just per se. It is always a matter of interpretation, right? So you cannot arrive at the beginning of the third millennium and saying, well, making the point that, well, we still have to make this dramatic research to sort out what happened in detail, because what we know that we have already done that fundamentally. Aside from, of course, certain things that, however, are not going to redraw in that regard the broader dynamic, it's the broader picture, rather, that is obviously just more prone to be misunderstood, instrumentalized, and sort of twisted, right? Because it's the bigger topics, so that every idiot can handle, at least in the awareness of their existence, and so where the misconceptions are going to fall more than much, right? It's not how people ate at the time, or what kind of lifestyle they had every day. We're talking about history is fundamentally politics, right? When you study history, it's not society, just per se. It's not even war, but it is politics first and foremost, right? And from there, then you can expand into a broader understanding of the rest in depth, right? With a precedence, right? Economics is not more important than warfare, right? The magic triad is politics, war, society, right? Economics just also for the sort of Marxian ethos is just contained within society conceptually. So aside from this, there are certain interesting aspects that I think can help sort of make us looking at them more interestingly and somehow accurately and with a greater criticism, right? Because banally, right, how many times have you watched a documentary, a movie, have you, or any sort of broader popular form of education that talked the Saracens, right? When you talk about the Saracens, which is a term, by the way, that comes from an ancient tribe of the Sinai, the Sarcenoi, and it's an ancient name. It's just a synecdoche, just like Normans, right? It's and even more actually, because the Normans more or less came from one area, right? That could be easily identified. Like with the Saracens, the thing is more complicated. This may have actually played a role in the narrative of and why, of course, they are less represented because people do not often understand who they actually were in practice, right? So that the term is extended, and I give you that literature helped in that too, to the broader, say, Islamic world in Mediterranean. Let's put it this way: the Saracens are the guys against whom the Crusaders fought, right? That's the main, and I don't think it's wrong, at least in my culture, in my world, etc. That's fair to say. It's not, you can't blame a person for saying, well, that's too much of an approximation. Yes, as Westerners, we study less that world, and so to us, like say the Saracens, you simplify the thing. But in more serious history, of course, when we talk the Saracens, and especially from our continental background, we definitely do talk about this specific, essentially pirates that infested the Mediterranean, and about whom has been written the most, in fact, in what was likely, yes, the most relevant case that was, again, mainly the central Mediterranean, primarily Italy, and southern parts of southern France, and not only, right, also part of the Balkans. This is not the thing, and that, in fact, in this sense, we separate from for example, from Cordoba, from the Emirate/Caliphate eventually. This is already an important distinction, because mostly for Spain we talk about the Moors, right? We saying, well, that's the Moorish, the thing. We talk the Saracens more specifically is these mostly Tunisians. I think it's fair to, at least in a geographical sense, to appreciate the fact that we are at those latitudes and longitudes, and mostly the devastations, the effect, the incursions in southern Italy, right? But not all, right? Southern, central, in part also in northern Italy, of course, but mostly in the south. So that's the guys we're discussing today, and of course you know the background of these peoples. The Caliphate had expanded right from the Indus to the Atlantic to immediately fragment, essentially on the same basis of the main regional powers that had existed historically in these areas: Spain, Tunisia, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia. Right, that's basically it. Right, you have other, say, regional scenarios, of course, but Arabia remained pretty much what it was before. In these countries, you have essentially the population gradually converting to Islam. It was initially enforced, of course, but just mostly as for a co-opting fundamentally the local elites that began to work immediately for the conquerors. That in part, yes, they were Arab, but mostly they had brought with them peoples that were just siding with them, just as these guys were doing. So at best we can talk about that regional basis and Arabicized elites, right? Just to make an example, even in the early centuries, Spain was invaded not by the Arabs, but essentially by the Berbers of North Africa, commanded by some Arabicized leaders, and Arab in certain cases, of course, but let's say meaningful in terms of statistical relevance. This was mostly a shift in, again, this country's management that was in part due to the actual exhaustion of the world at the time, in a broader sense, and also with the unsatisfaction of the Byzantine rule in many ways. So we'll keep talking about these things, but that's where things get really interesting, because essentially these even though, and that's why I made that political premise at the beginning, even though of course these topics, Christian versus Muslim kind of concept, is important and should be sort of reevaluated in itself. Whenever you look on YouTube, for example, on this dramatic videos on, oh my God, what were the Crusades bad or wrong or whatever? Say the point that is missed, generally speaking, and that you understand that this channels often just do for the sake of getting mostly the sympathy of one side or the other, is that even though there was Christianity and Islam, and that the two worlds were fundamentally and neatly shaped as such, and were surely in conflict with one another and so on, there is a transcendent imperial ideology that revolved around the different ways these guys had essentially looked at God and how they had to enact that, plus the sort of regional divides. I mean, pick the same area of Tunisia. The Normans successfully reconquered at some point Sicily, that had been taken over by the Aghlabites, and eventually they reduced Tunisia to a sort of client state, whatever. But it's pretty obvious that, for example, the efforts during the Reconquista were mostly triggered by a mechanism that, albeit stemming from a broader awareness about the existence of the Islamic world, was importantly interconnected, was still responding to dynamics that were being played within the tribes of the Atlas, and especially within Spain, that the same crusades were an obvious direction of expansion, and not just for, let's say, the fact that the holy places were in the hands of the Muslims at some point, but just responding to the obvious need of reconquering the world empire, right, that all these peoples had always had since even before Christianity and Islam, of course, always had, right? But if you look at the narrative there, it's not that the two things were separated. Politics and religion are still always, cannot be separated, right, in any case, even in an atheistic reality. The point is understanding in that broader concept what was the background of it, right, which I think that whenever I explain traditional religious history, I think you start getting, compared to what I see, because I don't see it around, right? I often watch biblical commentaries, exegesis, and it seems to me that, for example, the notion of even just comparing different religions and realizing that they basically believed all the same things and it just had a different declining of the same essential concept of world domination, which is also the only, I think, worthy reason for existence, is not really, it's really not outlined. It's not taken into as an equation. In the basic, again, even the religious differences that exist in the scriptural variety, say, between religion and another, still seems to be sort of an amputated and oblivious effort to make sense of things that, yes, at some point were also forgotten compared to ancient wisdom, but that were still, if you read, I don't know, the Laude Nove Militia by Bernard Clairvaux, well, is purely and identically the same piece of doctrine that an Indo-European knight of the first millennium BC would have recognized immediately. More of that to say, but aside from the Crusades, these things were going on, and they were going on already from quite a while, on the basis not simply of, whether here people were Christian or Muslims, because actually you shouldn't be surprised to know that many Saracens were Christians, and that at least this shouldn't be a mystery for anyone, but that it's evidently a concept that is not being popularized, and so we say Saracens, which is not even, again, even a concept, that it's a purely philological synecdoche, right? It's not even connected practically to the peoples that we are looking at today. There is also a different scenario going on, which is the Eastern Mediterranean, where you actually have even this dynamic even more pronounced, right? There were, these things went on for a long time, right? But for some reason, we picked the 9th and the 10th century. Have you ever wondered why? The Islamic conquests were in the 7th, in the 8th century. Why do we talk about Saracens mostly in this narrower, historical sense? Because, of course, of the fall of the Carolingian Empire. If that had not happened, these guys would have not essentially done, right, what they managed to. We've seen in the video about Byzantine Sicily, for example, and also in broader Carolingian history, how, again, active, for example, the Christians were from Italy in North Africa all the time. Think about, the various rulers of Byzantine Sicily and their sort of decentralizing attempts. These were guys who routinely interfered in the struggles for power among the Muslims in Tunisia, and that were using Islamic mercenaries. They were talking before the Byzantine conquest, the Islamic conquest of Byzantine Sicily, right? And that were allied with some of these guys, right? And hosted them when they were exiled, and then intervened there, and sometimes they fought against them, etc. Boniface of Tuscany, right? We're talking Carolingian times, right? Could be a guy that simply took his ships and carried out raids on Islamic Sicily and Tunisia, and by his own initiative, in a sense. Of course, they were fighting against these guys because they were expanding just in that direction. They were competing, of course, with a power that was of a different religion, but that also fundamentally destabilized the frontier that this had, right? We're talking Carolingian Italy, and I made videos about this, by the way. And so obviously there would be this activity going on, but how many times do you hear about this, right? Somebody on YouTube woke up and discovered that, yes, the so-called First Crusade actually was not, let's say, even the concept of calling the Crusades poses problems, because these things had always been going on, right? The only thing that actually distinguishes the Crusades just for by themselves is the fact that now the Pope was able to launch on a regional scale major military expeditions just by calling the entirety of Christendom to fight in that sense. So there is no doubt that the First Crusade was the most clamorous enterprise in that way. And that throughout it, of course, and also just because we're talking the 11th, the 12th centuries, etc., so we have more sources, which is not something that you have to give for granted regarding the mechanisms, how these things operated normally already from before. A Christian power, like a Muslim power, like a pagan power, always launched military expeditions against one another exclusively, totally, and always, without any exception ever possibly documented, in the name of God, right? And don't come to me and tell me that the pagans didn't have God, as opposed to just gods, by the way. Basic, even just Christian, Jewish, or Islamic theology. Look at what the Trinity is, and look at what, the hypothesis. People still believe, I don't know in which kind of world we live. how people can have been so. Just remember that this has been imposed on you. You have been mentally engineered to think like there was an age of religion and an age in which we got rid of that because it was dumb, right? And the only reason is because you are dumb, right? And this is the same goes for monotheism, polytheism. Yeah, keep believing that if you want. Right? These are things normally taught in the very manuals of history of religion today. Right? And that speaks volumes about the radical under-education of even the actually most educated countries in the world. Let's not even talk about the others, right? But the point being that we are also heavily affected by the way historiography has presented such things, as much as the same availability of sources, right? For example, I studied my life just mostly about what we could call the Western Saracens, right? But I'm aware of the fact that there is quite of a, say, branch of historiography that deals, even though there is surely less overall, because Byzantine and Arab sources were less insightful and less critical, and also way more concise and somehow stylized than the Western ones already at this point, for all those who think that Western Europe was underdeveloped and that it magically emerged. That's the other big lie, that it was because of Arab civilization or the Byzantine manuscripts that the Western world magically rose and had the Renaissance and whatever. By the time Crusaders were conquering the Levant, etc., there were Western European people who were already literate in, of course, Latin, Greek, and Arab and Jewish, that went literally to Islamic Toledo's library to pick, because they already knew what was there, what kind of works existed. So this was the allegedly cultural, literal underdevelopment of these guys, to translate them, to bring them home. Right? I will not even digress on the idea that the Renaissance would have been triggered by a bunch of Byzantine manuscripts. I think I made enough videos about the severe as radical civilizational development between Western Europe and the Orthodox world in the, not just even in the late Middle Ages, but for a substantial amount of time before, measured in centuries, or even like there is something deeper, right, in what we must understand as being the expression of a culture, right? A highly elitistic and crystallized sort of sophistication and sort of development doesn't mean that the rest of the system produces with dramatic output just by itself, right? It is true that Western, Eastern Christendom and Islam were comparable at a point. Definitely by the 10th century, the 11th century, we're looking at pretty similar worlds in many ways, and not everything was like Baghdad, and not everything was like Scandinavia, definitely. So there is something in between, and Constantinople, Rome, well, think about these things, because we have embraced fully the catastrophistic idea that, again, the West collapsed, that was an end of the Roman Empire, that everything crumbled, everything was changed, right? But even with the Islamic invasion, definitely this is not much the case. One of the most important things to appreciate here, as I was saying before, is not just the causes of the Carolingian collapse, which I'm not going to discuss today, but of course the consequences as well when we look at this second invasion, right? There is a reason if the Magyars, the Saracens, and the Vikings operated more or less at the same time, right? The 9th century was even harder than the 10th, telling the truth. It was at least a moment of greater It depends, of course, on the areas, but if you look at the overall picture, you realize that definitely the Magyars are a bit the tail of this, but the wars of the Saracens and the wars of the Vikings came more throughout the night, and that's something you want to appreciate regarding what it meant about Gaul and Italy, especially compared to Germany or to England, for example. And don't underestimate that ever, right? But what you want to appreciate is also the fact that these forces all were attacking more or less at the same time. So they were concentrating their effort. Of course, we do not see a true coordination. That these peoples were responding essentially to their contingent needs and to the opportunities that were presenting at hand. They were quick in learning, quick in organizing, but at the same time, this was, of course, increasing the threat, and so proportionally triggering a response from the other side that in some cases did turn into a coexistence for reasons that were exquisitely political, right? Think about, we'll talk about it now, the avant-post of Fraxinetum, right? That thing existed in Provence, threatening northern Italy, even southern Germany, and say the southern France, Rome, the Rhone Valley, etc. Because the Ottonians and the Cordobans were fundamentally agreeing on the fact that given the current balance of power, okay, well, that Islamic pirate nest could remain there. Right. The interesting thing is that, of course, most of the sort of Tunisian Saracens were sponsored, Tunisian, Sicilian, were sponsored by the Umayyads, right? Were sponsored by the bigger power. It was a true state, right? Just like the Byzantine Empire, right? You have there the old, essentially, Roman Persian model, right, of bureaucracy, permanent army, sort of stattal administration. Of course, it's not optimal. There are some, even before the end, some evident forms of decentralization, of feudalization, of privatization, and so on. But it is true, it was substantially different from the Christian Latin Germanic system, which was already feudalized, and so making a greater effort to establish sort of more centralized states, but that at the same time was cultivating the same from a stronger basis, right? With peoples had been historically injected with this sort of moral drive coming from the invasions that were true invasions of, say, migrations of peoples, right? And so substantially different from, for example, the Islamic conquests, and had created a hybrid between modernity and tradition that is usually, in fact, in history, the most effective cocktail, right, that allows, after a sort of gestation moment, eventually the system to boom dramatically, as it would make effect in the High Middle Ages, starting from this very century. Consider that the entire notion that the year 1000 was the beginning of the rebirth has been debunked historiographically for the simple reason that, say, at least the cause why this was believed is that we start having sources documenting this greater development, and that happened, of course, when the development had already borne its own fruits. And it's actually the 10th century, from many indicators, not just from this logical, reflection, that, and so the very 10th century that was allegedly this terrible time in which all the peoples were scared and this enemies arrived from the outside and there was nobody who could do anything, that actually the system began to expand dramatically at a political and social level. I made many videos about encapsulation, that also for a time was believed to say, that they built castles because they were actually defending from these invaders. Actually, it turns out that most of the castles built in Europe at the time were not actually the ones used to defend from the invaders, were in some sort of more impervious areas, choke points, and were later abandoned. But they were in the very center of the major, and more productive interland, right, that was used by the local nobility to essentially fight against one another, dominating the local populations, and in this competition strengthening the system from the within, and in a largely autonomous way from what these guys would have. Imagine that Europe had been isolated, right, and the Carolingian Empire would end because, of course, it had overstretched, and now there wasn't the continuous sort of prepaid mechanism. There was no land to give essentially those guys to maintain their own fealty to the king. Yes, they would have made the system crumble, but they and surely there is no doubt that they would have solved the problem much better without these invasions. But fundamentally, they would have done pretty much the same thing. I mean, the mechanism of regeneration would have occurred anyway. Let's not underestimate of course, the drive that the second invasions brought, because, and that's why you cannot quite isolate a country from another, thinking that the history of a country is the history of that country, and it's not actually the history of the world. That these peoples that had remained at the fringes of civilization were largely envious and sort of ideologically adverse, but to civilization per se. And the myth is not, again, the terrible Christians that came to convert them forced. This did happen in many occasions, but this same world, look at nobody had to invade the Magyars to have them Christianized. Nobody had to invade Scandinavia to have them Christian. They Christianized by themselves, and for obvious political and social advantage that brought these countries also to be more powerful than they were before, to say the least. And so again, if you listen to me for the first time, just know that my channel has an overwhelming and underrated amount of videos on these very topics that I say they are underrated because people are not educated to even hear that this is a major historical deal, right? You think that the major deal is that somehow these invasions happened, but the much bigger deal is that this world was literally becoming to boom from the within, right? And it had all the ingredients to do so by itself, right? And this is not to say the invasions were not important, but this gives you how the scale of how much more important this other phenomenon actually was. But in any case, crushing these populations was exactly the same ideological sap that allowed Europe to boom in this century. So other reasons why these topics are told in very different ways are sort of racialistic, right? There is some schizophrenic behavior about that too. Of course, in Victorian England, the Vikings were sort of bloodthirsty animals who came to massacre everybody, rape, etc. And it was not even that far from the, say, at least a picturesque way of defining that. But say, of course, 100 years later, the Vikings, in the age of multiculturalism and illegal mass immigration, etc., became the bulwark of Europeanness and whiteness and identitarism, and so they switched right from the the bad guys that became the heroes, from the monsters that became the heroes of the situation, and this is exclusively basically because they were the Vikings, and yes, it were so the whitest, the only true Europeans practically, or almost, among these guys, and there was a lot in British and so the Anglosphere historiography about the Vikings, because that's mostly what Britain got from these second invaders, right, from Scandinavia, and so that impacted the history of there. But let's say if there had been a another empire, right, say based in Central Europe or in Southern Europe, that had done what the British Empire did, of course today we would all be about either respectively the Magyars or the Saracens. There would be tons of movies and everything about them, and the Vikings were like, that's how the thing actually worked. And obviously, just to come to racialistic point, of course the Saracens are the bad motherfuckers that came, to pollute the race and to, again, this is what openly, racialistic ideologies were, to explain even why, I don't know, the descendants of the Romans are darker, to explain the sort of civilizational fall. This was actual, history in the 19th century. They literally believed that, or actually not entirely, like already at the time where, of course, historiography itself was in many ways more intelligent, even in the racistic mistakes they could make, than a lot of the one that we have today after, however, a long time of work. So do not underestimate certain ideas. And so today, because that was the take from that world, right? The idea is that who cares about the Saracens? Right, Southern Europe, that's, those damn papists, and, well, we don't care about them. They do not belong to the club of the cool guys, and we care only about a narrower horizon for that. And so it's even the Saracens, like black, those are, like the immigrants of today. For not talking about the Magyars, that are truly another story. Like, I think even say in many ways, those avalanches of peoples from the steppes, but it's Eastern Europe. We would never even bother ourselves to check that mess, ethnically, linguistically, racially, whatever. That's not important. This has a huge impact because it's not even wrong to be, of course, to feel, say, more connected with your ancestry and your country's history and whatever, but at the same time you must realize that if you're attributing some sort of moral values to that, you must be at least sure that what was happening in the rest of the system was to be compared in that degree, right? Because again, the thing that shocks me most of all, again, in as a medievalist, after years of videos on YouTube, in all the broader sort of circumstantial experience that I got from this stuff, is that there are entire chunks of European history, right? Not the history of Africa, that would be very, very important to learn. I know less about them too, but overall, like at least at a European scale, that are completely crossed out, right? The example of AI before, if a kid starts learning about the Middle Ages, ask, what it was about medieval this and that, it talks only about 1/4 or even less of Europe, practically. And it's extremely vague about all the rest. It's not even programmed to explain, actually, the history of even much more developed and sort of important countries that were really working at that time, right? Consider this, that European wealth remained overwhelmingly concentrated in southwestern Europe, and that if you think about video games like what are those that just set more or less in the same high medieval era, right? Of a late simulation of Mountain Blade, the stuff. That part does not exist. Like the entire vision of it is a sort of Anglo-Saxon meme, a sort of Norse meme, a sort of steppe meme, even a sort of Byzantine meme, and a sort of Arab meme. What about coherently the western part of Europe, the continental one, literally the most important overall, that has been cancelled, it's been removed, it's been literally and incomprehensibly extirpated from the mere awareness of its existence or consideration. And this surely does come from lots of reasons that do not even have to do with the Middle Ages, as you understand, but that are intolerable to this point in history. And let's be honest, like if we are trying to make an effective European Union in a sort of federal sense and with sort of imperial ambitions, aside from the fact, of course, that, but it's predictable, telling the truth, aside from the values that apparently, the European Union stands for formally, but that are melting in front of the first serious things that are happening in Europe, right? So the first serious problem, there are steps that can't be made to change things quite gradually. It's surely not the best time in history for doing that, because there is no doubt that as Europeans we got too dependent on others, and I'm completely fine actually as long as these others are part of the Western world, of the broader alliance of the fact that we are also military powers, that we do have our capacities, and I wouldn't, of course, belittle them, but of course the sense of a more cohesive, politically, European empire, I think, cannot happen historically in any way if we do not get violently straight the hardcore objective hierarchy of civilizational development in any historical circumstance, right? But even more, of course, for Europe itself. And I don't see this at all. I may be the only channel on YouTube that is actually making this point, because another branch would simply make a sort of populistic, paranoid, isolationistic, sort of racialistic, identitaristic, and of course incredibly and historically superficial narrative of winery about yes, there's no European identity anymore. Well, yeah, because what did you do up to now to actually even know what European identity is? You underschooled moron. And from the other side, there's just, leftism, and that we do not even qualify, otherwise I get banned from YouTube. But the point being is that that equates to nothing, even just inconsistent. And so I think there is even the opportunity to educate people. And the beautiful thing about educating people is that, of course, states have the legal authority to enforce this. Right, so if you manage to get to the top, you can do pretty interesting things, right? Half of the people I talk to normally, mostly Europeans, do not have the palest idea. There is a specific political reason, right, of dating to the blocks, but not only, that there is actually a European history. Right, it happened to me that essentially the eastern half of Europe is as if we're still living in a reality in which there is, like, their country understood in a strange, fictional way, and then there is basically complete darkness all around. The rest of the world does not exist, or at least everybody's an enemy, and it's post-socialist paranoia ingrained at every single level of existence, and of course no trace of education whatsoever. We have to. This is actually an enormous potential. This is a sort of virgin land. It's difficult to mold, right? But it's just like post-Carolingian Europe. If you start from the basis, you can't really make this thing bloom, right? And as Western Europeans, we have the means for doing that. We are, in spite of all, overwhelmingly rich, and we have an enormous potential just investing in the right sectors, in the right education, in the right values, in order to make things work. And the best thing about this is that these values do work for real, because they are divinely inspired, right? So they're not. It's not a secularistic or lacistic sort of utilitarian functionalism of some sort. It is the actual purpose of existence as far as also world domination is concerned. But going back to the Saracens, and so trying to picture them a bit better for what they were. And really loosely, because again, I made lots of videos about them already, so you can check those out. There is even a playlist, I think it's dedicated to them. As we've seen with this name, Saracens, motivated from, say, strange sort of onomastics of ethnography of the ancient world, you would design in Christendom Islamic groups of various ethnic origin, right? And we're talking Muslims here, so not necessarily even non-Europeans, right? That in fact from North Africa, but also from the Iberian Peninsula, in part, before I said that this is not the case, but yeah, in part they were, of course, understood as that too, but also from Sicily, that was gradually being conquered, or even from other bases of properly southern Italy, peninsular Italy, carried out pirate activities, right, in the Mediterranean, and aggressed the European coasts, right? This is what this world also is about. If you want to picture civilizationally the impact of peoples like the Vikings, the Saracens, etc., you have to realize that basically their major activity was piracy, right? This is not that they were not able to actually organize pretty good military forces in major expeditions with tens of thousands of people. This is what the Vikings, the Saracens did. If you think about the Magyars, they're right up to Spain, right? All these peoples, as we will see now, even for the Saracens, they went as far inland, right? Even Germany was invaded by the Saracens. It's just yet another thing that you hardly hear, but it is also notorious in Saracen history. And this piracy is, as you know, something that activates mainly in the moments of collapse of the bigger system. It's not like another empire on its own, right? The Saracens, let's get it straight, were not operating as part of, the caliphal military. In fact, one specific identifying characteristic of the Saracens in practice was the fact that this piratical activity was often autonomous from the political action exercised by the greater Arab dominations. And they were sometimes even a pain behind to the same. Of course, the Christian world was the privileged target because it was richer, it was in crisis especially, so it was politically fragmented, so what a better objective, right? This is what all these peoples assessed quite concretely. This happens all the time, historically. It would have not made sense to attack the same, say, Islamic Spain, but if you look at the North African coast, you literally don't have much of an option but to take the sea and to attack, the 3,000 kilometers of Italian coastline, for example. This is something that would last for a long time. It also developed an important system of defense that was, however, also a system of offense. The world wasn't being passive. This is the thing that I would like to stress the most. That again, the notion of the story of the terrible Saracens arriving, and so these populations of southern Europe being, just scared and taking refuge in the hinterland, is the entire picture is wrong, right? Southern Italy was particularly vulnerable. This is true because it was. It's not much that it was politically fragmented only. It was disordered to an important degree, right? If you look at this is going to be a long excursus, but I will surely make some videos about that. I don't want to annoy you excessively with my digressions, but to make long story short, like ever since the Longobards had arrived after the Gothic War, let's say, too, which had created some problems. And the Longobards had gradually, from the hinterland, harassed the Byzantine areas, even taken over almost the entire southern Italy, even the coastal one. And the Byzantines had sort of come back, and now also the Franks had come into play. And then these other guys came around. The entire, say, southern Italian landscape that had been historically the more developed in the peninsula was still very rich, but it was because of this lack of local unity and degree of external interference, of course, growing in a sort of unregulated way. This is a concept we rarely discuss, but it's like the same reason why eventually the northern maritime republics, for example, were the ones who would sweep the western Mediterranean of the same Saracens, and not the actually better predisposed southern Italian ones that had actually emerged even before chronologically. Think about Amalfi, I made a video about that. Well, the simple reason being that northern Italy had up to that point, a tidier sort of political, administrative, and sort of cohesion that had been reinforced, that it had started in Longobard times. It had stabilized for good. It had encompassed fundamentally most of northern central Italy, that were also reactivating, because again, continental Europe was activating itself, and so the Po Valley was really a strategic asset and the seat of the same kingdom. And it was a kingdom based, the Longobards had structured on the pre-existing Roman cities government. It was not a place like, Spain or Gaul, where, say, cities were important, but they had fundamentally remained just a pawn in the hands of the major landowners of the rural aristocracy, right? The Italic kingdom was fundamentally civilized, right, and habituated to develop orderly, right? But people were traditionally free in the cities. They had they ruled, like the local aristocracy was literate. This position, even in the Mediterranean during it, like at the frontier with the Islamic world, was particularly relevant, because if you look at Italian economy of the time, these, especially the maritime republics, were essentially developing within the broader commercial hub of the Islamic world, even if they were not ruled by that. In fact, you see it even with the Byzantine duchies in the south, Amalfi, Naples, Gaeta, etc. These were not, of course, even controlled or taken by the Saracens, right? They were always, they could even cooperate with them, famously enough, but they wouldn't, let's say, the Saracens didn't quite have even the regional capacity to storm major centers and just to keep them substantially under their control, right? For example, at some point there were these raids into Taranto and Bari. These were some of the most important cities, as a matter of fact, in Apulia. There were coastal ones. One was reconquered by the Byzantines, another from the Franks, that also showed that they could, still in the last functional time of the Carolingian Italic kingdom, launch effective expeditions to reconquer these important centers. But in fact, they wouldn't last quite much, right? Most of the Saracen presence was a sort of conquest of coastal strongholds that were fortified and used as point d'appui for the various raids all along the Italian and coastline and beyond, right? Of course, the Saracens invaded even the hinterland, but they were fundamentally raids, right? They mostly just controlled territorially the coasts of southern Italy, with population in the hinterland that not just remained under its own government, but that was literally at some point calling these guys to achieve basically the only notable military expeditions of sort. The largest Saracen armies in southern Italy were called as mercenaries by the same Longobard dukes in the south. Of the Longobardia Minor, I made a video about that too. And they were not there to stay. They were not there to stably to establish themselves, simply because, first of all, again, they didn't have the manpower. These places were overwhelmingly populated. They could act as soldiers, they could have this sort of roles, just like even the Normans did, but they were not part of that landscape. They were not integrated. They were not, let's say, absorbed in any substantial fashion, except in Sicily, where also you realize that in spite of the atrocious Byzantine resistance, was really, at least from the Byzantine Sicilians rather than by the empire, that yes, did defend the island, but not with the greatest commitment. But still, the Saracen conquests were very gradual, and there, of course, you realize that Sicily remained Sicily, and that these guys arrived and many people became Islamic. We know of, I don't know, black Ghulam slaves in the thousands brought in Sicily, which explains the points percentage of actual African ancestry in some part of the island, differently, for example, from the rest of the peninsula. Sicily was the only place that really had that sort of continuous Islamic rule. It was not even that developed as it's been sometimes said. Palermo was a big city, but it worked mostly like a major commercial hub. Fundamentally, it was not like one of the great capitals of the Islamic world in a representative way, simply because the Aghlabite power was not really much of a big power, right? They counted. It's like they overlapped the Vandals, the Vandalic. In fact, maritime-based power. From the Vandals did the same thing centuries before, from the same exact places with the same exact targets, because that's fundamentally what that power can do. If you have the upper hand temporarily, because the say the Italian peninsula is exhausted, right, or in turmoil, you can simply launch raids. You can sack places. That's like as the Vandals sacked Rome, the Saracens also profanated notoriously the basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul. You have Monte Cassino, Farfa being destroyed, so also significantly in the central Italian hinterland. But aside from these distractions, right, the best that the Saracens could establish there were fortified rings, such as the one at the mouth of the Garigliano River that was eventually taken out in 915 by an important coalition, in fact, of all the basically Italian powers, the papacy, the various Italic noblemen, the Byzantines. You have really this that, as you know, all together were quite shaded even among each other. After which, it's over. These guys do not pop up anymore, and so you understand you see, at least the Vikings did colonize, right, demically, in terms of manpower. They literally had a significant say ethnic impact on certain areas, because simply they also had strong needs of colonization in a way, because of whichever reason you can't. Climate change is not the only reason, but it's obvious that Scandinavia was was more subject to these problems of this functionality between, say, agricultural output, climatic conditions, and so the possibility of feeding more people that had at some point to find new lands somewhere else, and were less rooted even than the North Africans were. Tunisia was a fairly prosperous place, right, at this time, because it had always been. It was the Roman Africa, what the Arabs themselves called Ifriqiya as a consequence. And they didn't have much of a manpower from the hinterland. Even, of course, the Saracens were in part Berbers, even from the hinterland, even though they were not quite a sea-born race, but they were, for this reason, in fact, kept a bit out of the dynamic, because whoever ruled the North African coastlands was essentially a civilized people, and the Berber hinterland was just a primitive hell, right? And so there is even there a major difference with other areas. For example, Europe, the Magyars instead literally arrived as a migrating people en masse, and just shifting from a place in Eurasia and settling in another. So you understand how, say, different these things really are. And when you really get that the Saracens were mostly from Tunisia and Sicily, you realize that also lots of these people were Christians. I mean, this is notorious. Christians kept existing in Sicily. It is true, as I was saying before, that for the Islamic world were not very well documented. We do not know much about Islamic Sicily. It's just a cultural divide. The Arabs did not write in the way Europeans did. Western Europeans especially. This is true also for the Byzantines, but we know very well that also in the Eastern Mediterranean, way after, say, around the same period, so way after the early Islamic invasions, that really did come early, and so in a time in which, of course, the population there was Christian, overwhelmingly, and participated with their ships and crews to the siege of Constantinople. Of course, they were the most massively available manpower and material, of course, in the area, right? There was no way the Arabs could, of course, wage war against Constantinople otherwise with their resources. But the main point being is that even in the 9th and 10th century, we find even in the Greek islands that had been at some point captured by the Arabs, of course, Orthodox Greeks that engage into piracy together with the Muslims. It was perfectly normal, because, again, this is not much about what kind of, say, religion you follow, in a sense, but it is the intrinsic nature of the more developed guys want to maintain stability, right? And those that in the fringe are rebel because they're hungrier, they want more, but at the same time they're also less developed, and therefore the best they can do is piracy, right? That's the reason why, I don't know, look at the main emporia of the Viking era. Those are places that basically disappeared after the Viking era. It's not that they remain. There was no continuity with the previous time, because they didn't have sound bases, just like the entire background there didn't quite have on the same ones that, in fact, the Christian continent had. In fact, those bases would be laid only when those places began to be just like the continent, Christianized, feudalized, and again ordered in a much more functional fashion. Just the other day I was hinting at this as far as also the Anglo-Saxon versus Viking thing was concerned, because while it is true, as we were recalling before, that of course on the eve of the Norman conquest, Britain saw the existence of an Anglo-Danish kingdom in the south. Well, one cannot fail to see that it was fundamentally based on an Anglo-Saxon system. That it wasn't quite like, it was very similar, of course, compared to other parts of Europe, to Scandinavia, but it's always to a relative degree, right? The kingdom established by the English had been de facto something that in Scandinavia they wouldn't reach just politically or institutionally before a substantial amount of time. So never underestimate this stratum, because the story is always that and this is multiculturalism that brought the thing around. In many ways, nationalism, that is again the first step into socialism, brought us this idea that if you have a people with a sort of label fixed on them through a name or whatever you think that their meme fundamentally is, you think that whatever it's called in another way before, that you don't hear anymore, was cancelled. It passed. It did not exist. Right? We think that with Roman Europe, also in the West, in the Romano-Germanic kingdoms, etc. But multiculturalism loaded even more on that because, of course, it thrives in the in this, of course, national socialistic, because that's what also Nazism technically, we're talking about radical leftistic ideologies, really things compared to tradition, that is just a blend of course, specific categorical communitaristically intended races that just are always superimposing on one another, because there is no such thing like a true identity or a single one, whatever, but you still need to, in fact, crystallize these identities as such, because that's the paradox of multiculturalism, that everybody should be unique, but no, there are also actual, that's the communitaristic element right there. You can't quite distinguish them, right, of an identity that instead makes a group that cannot change is always that. And so we forget that those civilizational bases were, unlike most people think, like the Middle Ages, like as this Dark Age, etc., were not really. It doesn't even make sense to think they had ever risked disappearing at any time, right? And the bases were obviously still there. The same is true for the Magyars. I mean, what chance did they have to be absorbed into a Western system, right? They remained fundamentally where they were. This is true for, generally speaking, nomadic peoples. Historically, we look at the Avars, the Huns. Actually, the Magyars were slightly different. They had another story, and they were absorbed in different ways, also in a moment of general revival of the system. But say, what chances did have the Huns to have any long-lasting impact on, as on Western civilization? I mean, seriously. But I think that also in here, the 19th century was somehow a bit too dramatic regarding the sort of, in a sense, the demonization of these systems is okay, but they were presented as if they were truly a threat to the foundations of civilization than they actually were. And this is not to say that they didn't mess up things, but this is very true for the West in many ways, that the reaction was so, after all, slow, because it was not so warring after all. And only when you learned that the Vikings were thrown against, the various Carolingian, between the various Carolingian rivals and the other, that the same was true in the Eastern Frankish kingdom for the Magyars, or in Italy, among the various powers competing for the south. Well, you can't quite see the degree of Western superiority, and you will think that there was just some sort of abject, sort of dark time in going on, for which it's a miracle that medieval civilization even survived. That this is not factual history. This is just some severe cultural deficit, which again stems from most of the same dynamics for which usually these crises were triggered in the first place, right? So what can we say about the Saracens in this regard as well? The 9th century was the worst one, right? At this point, they controlled the Balearic Islands, Sardinia, Corsica. It's just like the Vandals did from Tunisia, right? That's the same identical thing. That blows your mind. of course, they had their own bases in Campania, in Apulia, but as we've seen, they didn't really go that far with any substantial headway in the interland, right? They could come as raiders, because even strategically and operationally, we can't quite stop in the 10th century, I don't know, thousands of men in arms wanting to raid into the interland. You can mobilize a certain amount of these troops, but at the same time, and you will, to the point even of dislodging these guys, but it's also, again, it's difficult to control. It's a world that is so politically fragmented that it's not much, again, about the fact that the communities can't put up a resistance. They would, but they wouldn't want to pay enough. This is just like today, right? People whining because there is the war and we have to produce weapons, but we should be happy of that. I mean, not of the war that exists, but in the fact that we can't simply invest and fundamentally reduce the issue, or even significantly altering it to our favor. And we are still here sleeping because we hope that the solutions arrive a bit by themselves. And of course, the enemies are just weaker, and so they are doing these things that can be nasty. But after all, they're not going anywhere with that. And of course, there is a moral issue behind that. I mean, when the Roman basilicas were profanated, I mean, Carolingian Italy was actually technically the center of the empire, because it was where, in fact, the current emperor ruled from, and the same imperial crown would be connected with, was, of course, expressing the greatest disconcernment for the sins of the Christians. This is how they saw itself. They began to build the walls around St. Peter. But this required a political and social mechanism that wasn't, let's say, slow to react because because of the heavy blow that the enemy inflicted, but because it was just complicated in a world without sort of a state, or at least one that is still very gradually and machinously trying to take off from say the contraction of the early Middle Ages. It's really just taking time to do so in the first place, right? But that's basically it. I mean, the peak of Saracen presence in Italy is just this 9th century. Even towards the half, it's even a relatively early time, taking advantage again of the frontier that existed between the Frankish and the Byzantine world, the fragmentation, the fact that the local communities were exploiting even the same Saracens to keep out both the Franks and the Byzantines at some point, literally using the Saracens as mercenaries, as we've seen. This really, it's not that the thing wouldn't get out of hand also here, but still, what did these Saracens accomplish at the end of the day? Politically, territorially, in this country? Practically nothing. So much so that the Saracen presence in peninsular Italy declined. And the Saracens founded, as an alternative, a vast base of operations in Fraxinetum, which is still known close to the Saint-Tropez Gulf in Provence. If you have visited Côte d'Azur, you know more or less the geography there. In what is still called, in fact, today the Moors Massif, right? It was a bulky fortress at the top of a mountain, fundamentally, that was very, say, as we'll see now, as soon as the Provençal Christian authorities were given green light, this basis was conquered and razed to the ground, right? It kept existing because the Ottonians were negotiating with the Spanish Umayyads regarding the balance there. It was useful for the Cordobans to have that Islamic base there. They had things going on with southern Gaul themselves, and that Islamic presence in the area was actually not stopping for centuries, well after the Arab defeat at Tours. And in fact, this base of Fraxinetum remained well beyond 970. And it's not strange, for a reason that we will explain now. First of all, just as we've seen for the Christian maritime republics in southern Italy that really also remained independent from Arab rule, but that prospered within the commercial circuit of the Islamic Empire, stretched literally from the Atlantic to Southeast Asia, right? So you see this beautiful taris minted in the same Christian centers, just to exploit, of course, the trade balance that was in favor of Islam at this point. They had more precious metal overall, and so profiting in the same space. You have the Provençal communities, especially the ones, again, Provence is basically the lower Rhone valley, right? So it's also one very urbanized and sort of very Romanized area, right? And they had historically it made a bit about the Kingdom of Burgundy, tried to escape Frankish pressure, centralization, or so. It was convenient for them, given that, as we will see now, the Fraxinetum Saracens went devastating mostly other areas while trading with them, right, in Provence. They preferred, literally, the Muslims to another strong Christian power. They were Christians. They didn't have any intention to become Muslim or to be under the Muslims either, but they preferred to have these Moors running around as long as it didn't create problem to them, which could happen but not that frequently, and going with that. Right, this is what technically happened, because the Muslims from Fraxinetum were able to mount up expeditions, rising up the Alpine valleys up to the upper Rhone and the high Rhine. So we're in Central Europe, right? They literally went to devastate and loot there. Also, they could descend into the Dauphiné, that I made couple of videos on if you're interested, and in Piedmont. So interestingly enough, you can argue that there was a Provençal connivance with the Saracens, because these guys went to loot where? In Upper Burgundy, that was traditionally becoming sort of the rival of Provence, right, of Lower Burgundy, the previous kingdom. In Germany, in the Upper Rhine, and in Italy, in Piedmont. This makes a lot of sense. Consider that from Fraxinetum, the Saracens had the access to the Mediterranean that was still largely in their hands, right, their piracy. Especially cities like Genoa and Pisa had already been starting to fight against them and so on. And so eventually they would give way to their pressure, but, right, especially until the Cordoban Caliphate was powerful, and also the Ottonians had that sort of capacity to at least negotiate with the Caliphate regarding their sphere of influence being mostly Italy and rather than Burgundy. The thing was going on, right? It's important to stress that the great defeat that the Ottonians suffered at the hand of the Saracens in 982 at Cotrone in Calabria is the break, in fact, of that balance. Right at that point, instead, the Ottonians were regaining substantial capacity in Burgundy. In Italy, they were reactivating the what would become known as the Holy Roman Empire, and they went as far as southern Italy to contend the area. Yes, from the Saracens, from which they were defeated. It was a massive, actually, slaughter of German noblemen. It was terrifying, lay and secular alike. As you know, Otto II barely escaped with his life. He was fished by a Byzantine ship that he eventually sort of threw himself off because he understood that the crew wanted to kidnap him, bringing him to Constantinople. So he reached the Calabrian coast just by swimming. But the sense, in fact, was that the Byzantines, rather, that were reactivating their presence in southern Italy, and they would keep doing so, also fighting the Saracens successfully, even trying to retake Sicily at some point before the Normans did. And so seeing how permeable actually this area was, and how the Saracens weren't this, overwhelming force, even if they could, of course, stand their ground, even cause such important defeats, is really telling you by, say, what other forces were agitating within the Western Empire, the Eastern Empire, and how these had, in fact, the capacity of operating essentially the single most decentralized parts of their possessions, that was southern Italy, for both of them, respectively, in a latitudinal and longitudinal way, and that was considered feasible, and sort of, let's get rid of these guys after all, once for all, as the system is overwhelmingly reactivating in the first place, right? The guys in Fraxinetum were really a pain in the behind. For example, at the beginning of the 10th century, they destroyed the rich abbey of the Novalese, and for decades they occupied the Susa Valley, periodically devastating central and southern Piedmont. This is relevant because the Susa Valley had historically been the gate for Italy from France, and also vice versa, especially considering that after the partitions of the Carolingian Empire, especially Mersin, Provence belonged technically to the Italic sphere, right? But that the Carolingians invaded and conquered the Lombard kingdom always from the Susa Valley, right? And the Franks had always had the upper hand from their side. You see, normally with two countries sharing, say, a mountain boundary, you have the watershed as the border. But historically, since the Franks were stronger than the Longobards, Frankish Burgundy arrived up to the Italian Valley from the other side. This was a bit the same like between the Longobards and the Bavarians. The Longobards were the stronger, so they had territory up to, well into the Danubian watershed of the Alps. And at this point, the Moors were entering essentially northern Italy from the same Susa Valley, from the west, right, from the Burgundian side. And they even stayed in there, as we've seen, and for decades, right, to literally garrison the pass and launching raids and eventually coming back into the mountains, because they could quite difficultly be taken out. And this is relevant because, of course, other things were going on, say, in northern Italy, for the local nobility to just even going to catch mountain goats into the depths of the Alps. And so that was those raids were technically not even the worst thing that could happen, even though the blows were heavy, as we've seen, and especially symbolic, because just as the Eden Vikings and Magyars, they targeted the rich monasteries that were truly the connective fabric of post-Carolingian Europe, also in a patrimonial sense, in many ways. And so you understand the dynamic overall. It's a predatory behavior, but it's also from these outskirts the admission of inferiority. These guys were not conquering any land, right? The only major acquisition was Sicily, that was essentially just taken by exhaustion in a sense, and the Aghlabid rule of Palermo in the western half of the island didn't basically extend itself much beyond, right? The Arab adventurers and other settlers were scattered all over Sicily, but there was no such thing like even their sort of unitary sort of force, other than the, of course, aggregated one, especially in search of loot, but also capable of mounting up significant expeditions, like we've seen even the army of Cotrone or other mercenary expeditions into the southern Italian mainland. That would, however, be able to threaten peninsular Italy, which was just a bad idea, especially in any case, because there were, say, the northern you went, the more forces there were, and southern Italy was just a hell of a place in terms of, as anybody who ever fought there found out, just mountains and mountains, valleys and valleys. It's a nightmare, to say the least. And the Longobard hinterland controlled everything. That's the reason why not even the Franks or the Byzantines could do much about that, right? Until the Normans arrived, and the Normans managed to do so because they took over from the within. They took over as mercenaries from the within of the centers of power, right? But if it hadn't had to be simply an external conquest, right? Good luck with that. Sicily, on the other hand, was very soft because it had not developed. It was an open area. Of course, there are some parts of the hinterland that are difficult to storm, but the Normans had time and sort of method, and there was no broader political cohesion. There was no feudalism. There was no. Again, it was easy, right? There were some Muslims that favored the same Norman conquest at some point because they understood it would have been better. At least many Muslims came back to Africa when Normans took over, but of course we are documented about that. It was full of Saracens who fought for them, and that kept living there even afterwards, right? So you must be able to distinguish from merely a religious basis what you've as it's instead mostly being told you, being the major deal, and projecting this automatically to the Crusades and whatever. Yes, of course, it was a broader sense of the fact that the Muslims had been the ones who had broken the Christian unity, had invaded, had been etc. But at the same time, at a local level, right, things were always sort of make always more sense than even the bigger picture and even the bigger expeditions like the Crusades later on, and that were just like the increasing scale of that sort of continental capacity to regain in a fairly easy way what seemed to be, of course, the most say convenient land to regain. Why wouldn't a European empire reconquer the Levant? Right, this was the case with the Romans. Why shouldn't it have been the case with the medieval civilization? Right, there was also much more extended, and that for this reason had also more internal issues and interests. So it's the reason why also the Crusades in the Near East weren't that sort of engaging for Europeans overall, right? In spite of the benefits they could have, but as a broader phenomenon, of course, there were more important things even within Europe that were occurring for the capacity of the same Europe to maintain a control. And there were, of course, failures in, say, there were sort of back and forth in terms of the motivation always. These systems were slow, right? The Islamic ones were too, the Byzantine ones were too. So when you look at this attrition and at this sort of slow, gradual recovery, etc., it is just intrinsic, it's inherent in the system at the time, but it's also very fast when you realize how also overwhelming that the Western reconquest concretely was, and especially in these areas. For example, you cannot explain the dramatic naval sort of technological engineering capacity and just the sheer military power of the maritime republics, if you think that in the previous century, so that they immediately displayed in the 11th century to sweep again the entire Western Mediterranean from Islamic piracy, and without, but this is, say, a bigger deal than it seems, because it's not just taking over those strongholds on the coast, it's literally becoming dominant to a degree that is just for good. Like basically until the Ottomans, you don't find say an Islamic activity, like, and this is not celebrated. Like we celebrate the Romans putting an end to piracy, but we don't celebrate the Europeans putting an end to that in medieval times, right? The Italian maritime hegemony. It's very strange, and it makes you understand how, in what kind of guilty mindset we have drawn this history, mostly from the 60s, the 70s, to morally relativize this entire story for what it actually was instead. But I mean, you cannot, in fact, nobody points out the obvious. How was it possible for example, those maritime republics to be so developed just after 1 century of this alleged disaster of the Saracen invasions, if it hadn't been actually much of a disaster in the first place, and hadn't actually triggered a much, already well-rooted potential of response, given the moral and material resources of Europe, right, in these very centers that were shrewdly growing within the same again Islamic commercial circuits without being, however, Islamic subjects either, right? In fact, the Islamic areas remain fundamentally very different in nature. Like in Sicily, you don't have maritime republics. Why? Even though they had Saracen piracy, you would think that it would develop them. That's not how it works, simply. Right? And it's a level of, say, Sicily had been more developed, say, than Liguria or the Venezia, and in ancient times. So what happened during these centuries? Right? Why isn't that, is it just a matter of predisposition, of determinism, of materialism? Evidently not. Right? Simply those cultures in the north were better organized. They were just superior. They were stronger. Right? And there's not much of a way around that, because they would go on dominating the Mediterranean for half of a millennium. And why does nobody talk about this? It's basically the same timeline. The of the Roman Empire. But somebody doesn't seem to realize this. So greater than the Saracens, and more ruinous of the same Hungarian one, was the destructive action exercised in Western Europe by the Viking raids. We will see that in another video. But relatively to the Saracens, I think that these simple ideas, if I also take all this time to make a video about that, I talk a lot, but I think I get to the point why this is the major deal. Why should we specifically address these topics? Because this very dynamics, right, can't simply be bypassed like, oh, look, these invaders arrived and it was terrible. It was such a depressed time. They terrorized everybody. They achieved such a big goal or result right against this. What was exactly this result? Being taken over in turn and by a system that was eventually just always more developed and capable and resilient and consistent, functionally dynamic to this one. There had been a crisis moment, one of disorientation, and one redrawing of the local sort of mechanism. There's surely an important factor that the St. Carolingian conquests had brought. And those were really big in a much deeper sense, right? Those had really molded this world, and they had also sort of brought them down. I mean, having been conquered by the Franks was not just a pleasant experience by itself, but let's say aside from the fact that these guys did rely themselves on the local communities, still they also provided them a military support, and when this support ended, because they were some sort of more elite and professional, whatever, of course the local communities had to again restart on their own, also not basically on a Frankish basis itself, but in a balance of order that was not just that single people holding the entire empire by themselves and having to restart. What we see effectively emerging in the High Middle Ages, many different countries in Europe, right, emerging as principalities, as kingdoms, as city-states, etc. Each one in their own space, each one in their own boundary, and essentially cooperating and dealing with one another and building great part essentially what also largely Europe is today, right? The same political boundaries by approximation, right? And I think this is always the immensely underappreciated value of post-Carolingian European history. That is, again, one of the single most important ones for the definition of the same blood and soul of Europe. I mean, even about this, how often do you ever hear even the concept is of a post-Carolingian Europe as a sort of world on its own? Hardly at any time, because the entire attention is monopolized by the Vikings, right? This becomes even the Viking era. It doesn't matter that there were also the Magyars and the Saracens. This is the Viking era. You have the migration era, then you have the Viking era. You don't even have properly a Carolingian era. At least this is very much in the Anglosphere, the sense of it. There is, even militarily, right? Look at major YouTubers out there talking about arms and army. It's migration era, Viking era. And you understand that this is not technically the best way to categorize anything, because it's not even a chronological problem. It's literally a matter of land mass and population and in actual consequences within the same period that cannot be summarized like that. Right? Why isn't there a Magyar era? Why isn't there a Saracen era? That's an answer you must get. Right? The Vikings may have been more important than those other peoples, fair, but definitely not by scale. Right? There is also a reason why the Vikings were more destructive. There was more to destroy in some areas, but these especially were the areas that collapsed the greatest, as they had been paradoxically the center of the empire, because they were actually the places that had become more powerful in terms of individual lordships. And so even for the Vikings, of course, you have a lot of cooperation, especially against the monarchy, from the nobility, as opposed to the people that, generally speaking, tended to feel more the need of the institutions holding, right, during these attacks. Right, so, and Gaul, generally speaking, was, the richest, like the largest pool, like it was easily accessible again through the major riverways, well into the belly of Europe. This was a bit more complicated to do from, say, the rugged terrain of southern Italy, and from just from land, from the east, like the Magyars did, right? So consider these factors as well, because these peoples have all a context on their own. So even in order to compare them, you have to assess how influential they eventually were, even from a cultural point of view, and in which countries, because they may have not been as important as others. This is just, I think, a methodological lesson that one must always consider. And again, it's even just anecdotically or notionistically, you can say that these peoples, in fact, went pretty much everywhere, except, of course, they were concentrating in certain areas for their raids. So it's fair to say, oh, look at how much they traveled and what fairs there were. Yeah, okay, but how much is, I don't know, the Viking colonization of North America celebrated or considered? Like, it should be celebrated, in my opinion, but as opposed to, I don't know, an army marching from Hungary to Spain, or to southern Italy, or to Lotharingia, back and forth, and organizing this regular. I mean, I'm waiting to see the next Osprey booklet, or the next video game, or the next movie, or the next YouTube video, or whatever on this, as opposed to, let's talk about the Vikings. Right? And again, the Vikings deserve all the respect that they deserve, in fact, but in a narrative that should be also much more concrete regarding, for example, their same operational capabilities. There are often, if you're passionate about the Vikings because you're one of those people that think that dressing up like one and trying to simulate mock combat among them is the most important thing, or useful, or historically concrete thing that you can draw from them, and you don't even pose yourself the problems of how to to mount up an expedition like one of the Great Eden Army, for example, or the various incursions into up to the Massif Central, just rising up the major French rivers, like, then you may have a severe problem. And that's what that just pertains to the military sort of operational side of the story, but about politically. It's evident that these guys were serving abroad, even later on, think about the Varangians, etc., because they had a great potential and they would have liked to, in a sense, they did succeed in part to bring the systems at home and to work to rule from there like that, in a way. So that's why it's also extremely important. I made multiple videos about this to assess Scandinavian warfare in the later centuries, as well as a quite careful, effective, cold, lucid, policy that people say, no, the fun is over because it's not the Vikings anymore, right? There's a Christian, man, it's bad. That's actually, in my opinion, the most interesting part of Scandinavian history, because the Vikings are glamorous and cool and whatever, but I don't know, I'm much more interested, say, in 13th century Scandinavia, for that matter, than and why? Because maybe I have some sort of deeper insight into the politics and society, not just sort of video gaming, pop culture. Well, that may be the case, but not all, because I'm a legitimate expert in the medieval art of war in my own right, and so I tend to think that it's also about what, I don't know, Scandinavian armies in the 13th century were about that really is very intriguing and also much better documented, by the way. So, and the Viking era never really died completely. We've seen it in that video recently about the Battle of Largs, but we will have to talk about the Baltic Crusades a bit more. And even there you have an interesting comparison of the fact of how the Germans, for example, had the upper hand in that mechanism, as opposed to the Scandinavians, who still had to grow, right, compared to the continent. And Germany was not that, say, distant in development, but surely had belonged to the Carolingian Empire, was a country of older Christianization and feudalization, so it worked better, and you must explain that. You must be able to compare that effectively, exhaustively, cogently, and that's why I make all these videos. And I'm actually sorry that I haven't made more videos about Viking history, because it seems as if I didn't like it, but I don't know, it's something wrong in the video cycle here, because they just appear less frequently. But this also means that it's a random thing, and so if I haven't up to this point, more will come later in proportion, so let's stick to that. We will keep also talking about the Saracens, of course. Again, there is a playlist for that. There is an Islamic history, Islamic warfare playlist. You can check that all out. These are just overall reflections on the topic. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.